Smearing those who raise this is exactly what led to the victims being ignored and the crimes covered up in the first place. So will the Home Secretary apologise on behalf of the Prime Minister for his language last week? Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, it is not true to say that the previous government did nothing following the ICSA report. The last government set up the Grooming Gang Task Force following the ICSA report, which led to 550 arrests of perpetrators in the first year alone, and I'm glad the new government is continuing that work. In April 2023, the data collection on the ethnicity of perpetrators was initiated, but the initial publication of that, I think last November, showed the collection is incomplete. So will the Home Secretary ensure the police follow through on the work initiated in April 2023 and ensure the data is collected more comprehensively? And the mandatory reporting recommendation was introduced as an amendment to the Criminal Justice Bill, which fell due to the early election. And I'm glad the government say they will now pick that up and take it forwards. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, previous reports and reviews did not go far enough. The ICSA report itself was mainly not about these rape gangs. In fact, it barely touched on the issue and only looked at 6 towns. We now believe as many as 50 towns could have been affected, so ICSA barely scratched the surface. Now, the Home Secretary just announced government support for only 5 local inquiries. Let me say this is wholly inadequate when we know up to 50 towns are affected. So I have some serious questions for the Home Secretary. Firstly, how are the other 40-plus towns supposed to get answers to the questions that they have? And these initial 5 towns, how will they be chosen? And secondly, the Home Secretary said nothing in her statement about the powers these local inquiries will have. It seems they will not be statutory inquiries under the 2005 Act. That means these local inquiries will not have the power to compel witnesses to attend or to take evidence under oath or to requisition written evidence. So, if that's the case, how can they possibly get to the truth when faced with cover-ups? In fact, it was precisely that problem, the lack of powers, that led the chairs of the Manchester local inquiry to reportedly resign last year, because they weren't given the information they needed by public authorities and they didn't have the powers required to force its release, and so they resigned. These powers are needed, the legal powers, because these crimes were deliberately covered up in some cases. We heard just a week or two ago from the former Labour MP for Rochdale, Simon Danchuk, who said that the then chair of the Parliamentary Labour Party told him not to raise these issues for fear of losing Muslim votes. Truly appalling. Now, not a single person has been convicted for covering up or ignoring these crimes. In my view, the criminal offence of misconduct in public office might apply. And moreover, those vile perpetrators who can be deported should be, every single one of them, changing the law if needed to do it, and using visa sanctions with countries like Pakistan to ensure they accept back eligible perpetrators. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, what the Home Secretary has announced today is totally inadequate. It will only cover a fraction of the towns affected, and it appears these inquiries will not have the legal powers they need. That is why we need a proper, full, national public inquiry covering the whole country and with the powers under the Inquiry Act needed to obtain the evidence required. And it's not just me that thinks that. In the last week or two, the Labour MPs for Rotherham and Liverpool Walton have called for a full national inquiry, as has Andy Burnham, the Labour Mayor of Greater Manchester. And I commend those members and Andy Burnham for their courage in speaking out. Recent polling shows the vast majority of the public want a full national public inquiry, including 73% of Labour voters. But most importantly and finally, so do victims. Jane was groomed and abused at the age of just 12. She was gang raped repeatedly. She told the police and she told her social worker. At one point, the police even found her being abused by an illegal immigrant. But instead of arresting him, the police arrested her. Jane still doesn't know if any of her abusers have been jailed or if any of the public officials who let her down so badly have been held to account. Jane now wants a proper national public inquiry. Home Secretary, why don't you?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, these are the most vile crimes against teenagers, against children, against young girls very often. They involve sadistic abuse, rape, and the most appalling trauma that can then last for very many years. The independent inquiry into child sexual abuse ran for 7 years and took evidence from 7,000 victims and survivors across the country. And too many of those voices and the bravery that those victims showed has too often just been ignored. And whilst he says he took action, I'm afraid his party had 10 years to introduce a duty to report child abuse, to make it a responsibility on professionals to report, to make it an offence to cover up child abuse. It was something that I was calling for 10 years ago, the Prime Minister was calling for 12 years ago, and he failed to do it, and we have lost a decade as a result. The independent inquiry into child abuse also ran a 2-year investigation into child sexual exploitation and grooming gangs. And one of the shocking things that it found was less is now known and understood about the prevalence of this appalling crime than prior to 2015. So in that period, from 2015 to 2022, even after we knew about what had happened in Rotherham, and even after Baroness Louise Casey had identified the impact and the failure to address issues about race and ethnicity, again, the previous government went backwards on issues around gathering data and information and the need for proper evidence. And that is why this government has now commissioned Baroness Louise Casey to instigate a rapid review to uncover the prevalence of this appalling crime across the country, with no holds barred in the way that we know that she will conduct this inquiry, to actually fill the gaps in the evidence rather than rerun the same questions without the evidence and the data that we badly need. And I would also point out to him, his party also weakened the disclosure and barring rules in 2012, again making changes that I and the policing minister opposed at the time, and the independent inquiry has recommended reversing in order to keep children safe. Rightly, but again, his party failed to act. Now, I hope that the action that we have announced should be supported right across the country, including the duty to report child abuse, proper penalties to cover it up, stronger sentences for grooming gangs, new rights for victims to get an independent review on reopening their case, new action to reopen historic police investigations, new standard for the police to meet, a new victims and survivors panel, a new audit of the scale and nature of child sexual exploitation and grooming gangs, led by someone who uncovered a lot of the problems in Rotherham, including their failure to confront Pakistani heritage gangs, new ethnicity data to be gathered and published, which he failed to do, new national support for local inquiries, including the Telford model, victims panels, and new work on accountability linked to the Hillsborough law to hold failures to account, because we will strengthen the law to do so, and a proper timetable for taking forward the independent inquiry, because this has to be about action and about protecting children and keeping them safe.